Hello, and you're very welcome to Adapt Radio. My name is Dr. Claire O'Connell, and today we're talking about AI and facial recognition technology.
From the Adapt Centre at Trinity College, this is Adapt Radio, presenting groundbreaking innovations, one conversation at a time.
Now, how many of you unlock your phone by looking at it? Facial recognition technology is becoming more and more commonplace, but what are the downsides of systems that use facial images and other biometric data to inform decisions in this world of AI? For example, in policing and law enforcement, what kind of risks to civil liberties and indeed human rights run in tandem with the potential benefits of using biometric data? The volume has been going up on these questions in recent years in Ireland, and joining us on the podcast today are two experts who do a huge amount of work in this area. Dr. Ciara Bracken-Roche is an assistant professor in the School of Law and Criminology at Maynooth University, and she's also an adjunct professor in the Department of Criminology at the University of Ottawa. Olga Cronin is Senior Policy Officer of Enforce and the coordinator of the International Network of Civil Liberties Organisations. Ciara and Olga, you're both very welcome to the programme. Now, facial recognition, it is a gnarly topic. I mean, you know, as well as our DNA and our fingerprints, our faces are very personal to us. So what is facial recognition technology? What does it actually do?
So basically, facial recognition is a type of biometric technology that uses artificial intelligence to identify individuals through their facial features. Generally speaking, FRT works by comparing a face print or a biometric template of a person's face taken from an image such as social media, from CCTV, or body-worn camera even, and comparing that template of a person unknown against a database of stored face prints or stored biometric templates of people known. So the single image is someone whose identity is not known, the databases of images of people who are known. And these systems, like I said, are based on people's unique biometric facial data. And like you mentioned, other biometric data would be fingerprints, iris, and these things that are unique to you. So this is why it's a unique identifier and it's a biometric technology. And essentially, we make this comparison now. When you think of databases of images of people known, different jurisdictions use different databases. So some might use passport databases or driver's license databases or possibly mugshot databases from law enforcement. But there might be just three other points that I might make, if that's okay. So when it comes to FRT, you first of all have live versus retrospective. I might also just make a point about threshold values and then just about being a probabilistic technology. So real-time or live facial recognition technology involves comparing a live camera video of faces against this predetermined watch list of people known. And then it would generate an alert for the police to act upon or not, whichever they decide. And these kinds of systems involve capturing many people's biometric facial data in the live video feed and comparing it against a watch list. And then you would have this capture, comparison, and possible identification all occurring pretty instantaneously. And then retrospective involves, instead of that live situation, involves the comparing of images against a database after the fact. So it's not happening in live time.
So it's recorded.
So you might have a CCTV footage that you want to apply the FRT to. But it should just be said that, you know, the European Court of Human Rights and the Court of Justice, they have said, you know, that the live use of FRT is highly and inherently more intrusive than retrospective. But at the same time, the judgments haven't really gone into much detail or explained why tracking a person's movements or attendance at certain events over months or years should be viewed less invasive of their privacy. And then just two other points about FRT. For the systems to work, and this is particularly relevant for retrospective use of FRT, a threshold value is fixed to determine when the software will indicate a possible match or otherwise. And should this value be fixed too high or too low or too high, respectively, it can create a high false positive rate or a high false negative rate. And there is no single threshold that can eliminate all errors. So this is why when, you know, we often hear on the radio, oh, FRT is just control and F, we'll get one person, it'll all be fine. That's actually not the case. So what will actually happen is that the person who is using FRT will get a list, basically a guest list, if you like, of people who this person could possibly be. So you will get person A, with a percentage score, person B with another percentage score. And this is just really important to understand, because I don't think this is said enough. It's presented as control and F, but it's actually not.
So Olga, can you tell me what you mean by control and F? Is that like finding something within a document, but you're finding something within a database of facial
Exactly.
images?
So we often hear on the radio either ministers or people who are in support, very much in support of bringing in FRT for the guards in Ireland, where they compare it to control and F. And this is a very simple, clean message to make it look like, there's no room for error, there's no issue here. But that's actually not the case. Like I said, they would get the guards, if they were to use it, would get a list. And this is why it's a probabilistic technology, I beg your pardon. But also, obviously, we don't want to kind of get wrapped up in the accuracy figures and over that, because we don't want it to be perfect, because that would bring a whole other new plethora of human rights issues.
Ciara, you wanted to come in there.
With facial recognition technology, it is a biometric measure. So it's uniquely identifying you. So when our face print is taken, I think that's a really important message for us to remember, that it can always be matched back to us. And so when Olga talks about the kind of control F, I think maybe, those in law enforcement or politicians presented like, a traditional lineup, perhaps, like that you'd be familiar with seeing on television shows. But really, that is not the case at all. So Olga's picked up on a number of things around retrospective and live facial recognition technology, around how, the technology operates. So we talk about kind of facial verification, so a one-to-one matching, so matching my image to me only, or is it a one-to-many matching? So it's scanning my face against all of these potential images in a database and then ranking, how likely it is that I am who they think I am, or whatever it might be. Those all vary depending on the company as well. And so that is something I also want to highlight kind of early on in our conversation, that when we think about facial recognition technology, the proprietary nature of how a particular software or company operate their FRT varies. And that's a big issue that we brought to government to say, how are you going to control for this? Clearview AI are a major provider on the FRT scheme, and they've been brought up in court. They have judgments against them by various privacy commissioners within the EU and then internationally as well. So I think there's some real kind of serious questions that come up around the provider. And just to add, to your introduction, Claire, and to everything Olga has said, I think it's really clear that FRT is not... And I don't want to say a drone is just a drone. I mean, I've studied drones for a long time, or body-worn cameras, but FRT is a step change, right? So I think you can already see how complex it is. It's not just this single technology, but it's linked to these vast databases. So it's a negative step change in a surveillance technology. It's qualitatively and quantitatively different. It relies on scraping these images potentially and forming these vast databases and running them regularly against the public to make them more efficient. And like Olga said, there might be this idea, people often say, well, if it works perfectly, isn't that great? We just find the criminals. But I think we need to ask, is it okay to capture all these images of individuals who have never been involved in criminality and who may never and have never committed a crime, right? Or just that people should be entitled to their privacy.
I absolutely get what you're saying. I suppose from my perspective, I see now every time I go through an airport, my face is captured and it's compared against my passport or whatever other data are in the database. So there's a lot of facial recognition technology about. Is the concern that it is now being to be twinned with law enforcement and policing? Is that where the concern comes in? Or is there just a really general concern about facial recognition technology?
I think that depends on who you ask, Claire. I mean, I think, a Luddite in a true definition, in that I am skeptical about technologies doing what they are purported to do, and then doing that in a safe way. So I think we need to be much more privacy protective around all of these new digital data-driven technologies. The airport is a very special space, right? The airport represents a state of exception. So things that happen in the airport aren't what we normally see widespread within society. Things that happen at the border aren't things that you see inside, let's say, the sovereign state, if you want to put it that way. But I think the problem is that it becomes normalized because we see it in the airport and because people use their biometrics to open their devices that they consider private and personal. But I do think, the use of FRT, and I'm sure Olga's going to say a lot more about this, with law enforcement makes it that much more invasive, right? I mean, and I think if you think about simple applications in crowd control situations at a protest, for example, when you're operating a surveillance technology, it can create a chilling effect. So by chilling effect, we mean it kind of makes people nervous and uncomfortable. It inhibits them from attending or engaging. And so therefore that impacts our freedom to protest. We also see with a lot of surveillance technologies, when they're adopted by policing and law enforcement, that they're taken up with one purpose in mind, and that slowly expands beyond the original purpose. And we call that function creep. So the initial function for which something is taken on becomes appropriated and again, normalized and accepted. And not to be too dystopian about it, but then, you can see where you can move forward into this kind of dystopic near future society where we're constantly subject to different types of surveillance.
Which does happen in some cities and jurisdictions around the world. But just before we get into that, I did want to point out that in Ireland, the AI Advisory Council recently brought out a report that specifically called out biometrics in public services, citing both the opportunities and the risks and how to safeguard against them. So what are your thoughts on the AI Advisory Council report, which was saying, that there are benefits to some of these technologies? For instance, it would cut down the number of hours spent in policing, looking through footage, etc., but they were very clear about the need for safeguards. So do you agree?
I think the AI Advisory Council's report on FRT was hugely important and actually reflected a lot of what came out in the Oireachtas Committee report and the Oireachtas Justice Committee discussions about the plans for FRT for the guards. It does talk about what needs to be done, but how that will actually be done successfully and robustly is a huge challenge. And I think that the council, really hammered that home. They said themselves that passing laws for Garda use of FRT would be a watershed development in policing and its interference with society in Ireland. It also talked about the misidentification risks, false positives and false negatives. It talked about the human in the loop safeguard that's often used as being, this is going to be fine. We'll always have someone who will overcheck or check something before an action is taken. That is not the safeguard that it's proposed to be by people who are in support of FRT. It also was really strong on the point that the Irish government and the Garda's reliance on a 99% accuracy figure just should not be used. And it went into detail about that, and I can explain that if you like in it later. And it also talked about how the guards would have to have some very thorough independent evaluation and resolution of the identified risks. And this is where it's really difficult, I think, for the guards and for the government. Going back to that proprietary issue that Ciara was talking about, and that kind of opaqueness around algorithms, the vendors who are issuing them, it's very, very difficult to actually get to the kernel of how they are used or how they operate and the testing behind that. And then you end up having these kind of figures and accuracy figures that are thrown around, but they're just not well suited to the Irish context. So I think that the AI Advisory Council's report is hugely important. I just don't know, and it's not clear to me, how the government are going to actually implement their recommendations, because I think it's really, really difficult. And like I said, in the Oireachtas Committee report, that report that came out from that committee put serious questions to the minister to answer, and we haven't seen those answers yet. So there's a lot we don't know about the FRT bill, and this is why it's still a huge concern for ICCL at least.
I was just going to say, I completely agree with Olga, and the report was very important. I mean, I do think when we look at public opinion, there's a lot of variation and nuance in the specific contexts in which people support a technology or not. And I think one concern that we've raised in an ongoing way in our engagement with the government on FRT is to be really specific about the context and how it's going to operate. So it's really tricky because they talk about these traditional processes of going out for tender. So they don't know who will provide the technology or how that technology operates before they call for the tender. But what we're kind of saying is these are all really important things that you need to consider because it is such a watershed technology. Sure, it could be used in beneficial ways, around people use the example of child trafficking, human trafficking, things like that, and who's going to argue about helping find a child that's being trafficked?
Or a missing person or somebody who's vulnerable, etc. Yeah.
That's exactly it. And you know what, Claire, that's where we see the support goes up. So if you want to use a drone to find a missing person or whatever it might be, to find victims in a crash, people love that. They're very much in support of that. But on a kind of more funny level, people don't like if a drone is being flown over a road, catching their speed, for example, right? So there is a lot of difference in how much people support things. And I think the problem is FRT has been presented as helping with all of these really serious issues like human trafficking and so forth, even child pornography and horrific things that we would want to push back against. But I think those are particular contexts, and thinking about function creep and the way that they might be more broadly adopted is a conversation we need to have now, rather than later on once we've brought the technology in.
I would add to that, Ciara, and agree with all of that. And I would also say that I think when it comes to biometric facial data in Ireland, I don't think people understand it in the same way that they understand fingerprinting, DNA, iris scanning, and I think that there is, certainly from ICCL's perspective, we do try and have that kind of education awareness piece about and try to explain what FRT is. But I think people equate it with CCTV. So, CCTV sees what you see and records what you see. You'll see a person on the street. You may know them, but you may not. But that's what you see. Whereas FRT adds a whole new layer of identification. And depending upon what system it's connected to, it could tell you a load of information, who you are, what your age is, where you live, where you work, who knows. So that's the difference. But I think there's a difficulty in people in kind of the public understanding that. But there's also an issue with transparency and people being kept in the dark. So, for example, if you look at the public services card, it's almost a 15-year project with the Department of Social Protection, but it's something that came out, 2011 or so, and it just became exploded in its in what it was needed. People need the number of people who needed one to get access to services, even though that should never have happened, which is what the Data Protection Commission found in 2019. Now we're still waiting for a report from the Data Protection Commission on the biometric element of the card. And what I'm talking about there is people were getting this card without realizing that there was a biometric template made of their face and that it was subjected to facial matching software. In 2023, ICCL and Digital Rights Ireland got hold of, under the Freedom of Information Act, data protection impact assessment of the PSC. And it showed these huge transparency issues where people just were not told that this was happening with their facial data. And now we're in a situation where there's plans to bring in facial recognition for the guards, but we have no idea what that database, that comparative database that they want to use. So remember I was explaining how there's one single image of someone unknown and there's a database of images, and we have no idea what that is. But there is a concern because the guards themselves, by their own admission, do not have a biometric template database. But the only one that we have in the state is the public services card. So there's a with the public understanding, there's an issue in terms of like an education piece, but there's also a lack of transparency from the state that, we're not just pulling out of thin air. So
Can I just dig in a little bit to something I've heard a fair bit about with facial recognition technology and the algorithms it uses, that they can be quite biased. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
100%. So I suppose the bias issue in facial recognition is that essentially, in a nutshell, it works less on people of colour and women. The main reason for that is how these algorithms have been trained. Essentially, they've been trained on images scraped from the internet over years. And it just happened to be that there are more faces of white males on the internet for longer. And that's really where that issue comes from. And so that's why we're seeing misidentifications predominantly or disproportionately affecting people of colour. And we've seen this in the US. I think there are 6 or 7 known cases of people being misidentified, wrongfully arrested and detained by police. ICCL was really lucky. We were very lucky to have a man called Robert Williams over last summer to talk about his experience. He was the first person known to have been misidentified and detained by police in Detroit. But we're also seeing this in the UK. A man by the name of Sean Thompson is taking a case against the Metropolitan Police. He was also wrongfully stopped by the Metropolitan Police, and a black man. And so we're seeing this in other jurisdictions as well, Argentina, Brazil. But I should say it's not just black people who are being misidentified, but they are disproportionately being identified.
And if that is a known issue, is that something that, if it is fixed, could it potentially be a fairer, more useful system?
So this is where it's very tricky for civil society anyway when we talk about FRT, because in the short term, or not the short term, but I suppose in the immediate, the issues are misidentification and those immediate harms. But if we go down the road of calling for FRT to be better and accurate 100% of the time, then we were stepping into mass surveillance. And so these are the kind of what I would call the twin dangers of FRT. 1, immediate, is misidentifications. 2 is that pervasive or mass surveillance issue. And bear in mind now, the misidentification piece, it's, like I said, it's not just people of colour. And there's a whole load of reasons why there's multiple factors why that can affect the performance of FRT. So if you think of the quality of the images taken from CCTV, the quality of the image that you're trying to identify the person from, the lighting in the image, the pose of the person, and then that creation of database of images against which you're comparing, like what's the quality of them. And then, like I said, that selected similarity threshold that police can change when they are using an FRT system. So all of those factors feed into what will become a suggested person for identification, or someone who would be suggested to be identified by a system. And then what action then would the police take after that? So it's really not just about an accuracy figure, Claire. There's a whole step, like there's many, many steps between a camera on the street and someone being brought into before the police for questioning. And then what can happen after? Like what we're seeing in the what we're seeing in the US rather, is that while we have these known cases of misidentification and people being wrongfully arrested and questioned, and actually some people, taking plea bargains because they just see it as a better way to move forward in their lives, a growing issue there is that people and defendants and criminal defence lawyers are not being told that FRT was used in the investigation against them. So they aren't even having the means to, robustly interrogate that investigation. So all of these are really emerging issues. But again, just that long-term consequence. So if we had no accuracy issues, then we're really talking about a very scary system, because it would just mean that a law enforcement authority would have this really unprecedented ability to instantaneously, identify and track us as we go about our lives. And that mission creep issue that Ciara was talking about, it's not hypothetical. Okay, Russia is not exactly a good example, but let's say they brought it in for security reasons for football. Then it was used to make sure that people were where they say they were during COVID. And then it was used to arrest protesters. Let's look at, even in the UK, it was largely used in kind of intelligence purposes. Just recently, they've installed live cameras in a part of London permanently. And then we see it in the retail setting. We see it even in Hungary. Just very recently, the government decided, and it was passed, that they would ban Pride, but they will allow the use of FRT to identify people who are defying that ban. And that's in Europe. So there was also one other example, which I find just really staggering, is in Madison Square Garden in New York. So that was brought in 2018 for security risks. And then in 2022, it was decided that it would be used to identify lawyers from law firms who were representing people and taking cases against the venue. So you can see how once something comes in for one purpose, there's huge pressure to be used for other reasons and used against us.
So it sounds like there's a need for a lot more, I suppose, public awareness, engagement, discussion about these things. And you were both involved in a public think-in with ADAPT and Beta Fest not so long ago. So how did that work? How did people engage and what did you find out about their thoughts about facial recognition technology?
The think-ins that ADAPT runs and that we help ADAPT run as researchers are really invaluable to increasing awareness about these new technologies. And so we've been very lucky to host 2 think-ins on FRT. What we normally do is we put out a call to various civil society organizations and to different mailing lists that we have to invite people to attend. And then what we do is we might work with a team of individuals to craft a scenario, because it can be hard. When people aren't aware about the technology, it can be hard to get them to come in and think critically about it and engage and understand it all at the same time.
Yeah, particularly because there's so much legality in different jurisdictions, et cetera, and different applications of the technology. So you came up with these scenarios that people could imagine themselves in. Is that right?
Exactly, yeah. So what we do, the format typically follows, and this is thanks to Emma Clark in ADAPT, I think, and her team. They have this kind of format that works really well. So it starts off with a couple of experts. So Olga was kind enough to speak on behalf of the ICCL. We had Daniel Kahn Gilmore, who had come over from the United States, from the American Civil Liberties Union. And they speak to different aspects of the technology. So it might be more on the legal side, or it might be more on different cases, like Olga had just been mentioning. And it gives that broader context, and then people turn to the scenarios. So they have time to read the scenario, to think about it against what's just been shared with them. And then we have prompting questions. And I have to say, though, what we do try to do with the think-ins is present an unbiased representation of the technology. So in the scenario, we wouldn't try to say that it's inherently good or bad, or even position it in a good or bad situation. For example, we use the case of your car being broken into and CCTV footage being run against FRT to find the person that broke into your car. So I would say a somewhat neutral situation, right? Everyone wants to figure out maybe who stole their stuff, who broke into their car, So we try to present it in a neutral way to allow people to present us with their genuine kind of feelings, perceptions, and responses to the technology.
And when people were presented with these scenarios and they sort of thought about them more deeply and put themselves in the shoes of people involved, what did you find?
Yeah, so I think it might not be surprising to you. So often people start off by thinking, well, I don't mind. I don't have anything to hide. And if it helps catch someone who's committed a crime, what's the harm? They do genuinely think of it like any other preventative kind of crime prevention technology, let's say. And guards do present it as a tool in the toolbox of crime prevention, and I think, or crime response, I suppose, and people feel the same way. And then when you go through the series of questions, and you start to get them kind of understanding, I think, the layers of technology that are involved, the layers of privacy intrusion, of identification that are involved, then they do start to become a lot more concerned. Now, I think it would be fair to say that most people don't turn fully against FRT, but it goes back to very prescriptive uses and context. So really clear guidelines, limits for use, and all of those kind of sort of protections that we would talk about to prevent something, like a mass surveillance system. But yeah, I personally struggle with that, because once something becomes introduced, it tends to be more widely adopted later on.
And how do you think that academic research can help to, I suppose, support better decision making and more effective regulations in this space?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are many different ways that we can do it through our academic research. I mean, so as I go out and carry out my research, I mean, I do try and interview various stakeholders. You know, I would be speaking to guards as well as civil society organizations, legal professionals, and maybe the public at large around their perceptions of the technology. You know, the public might have a valid concern about these various uses and that this might be echoed in legislation by legal professionals and by civil society organizations. Because when we're talking about FRT, for example, and these twin dangers, okay, so in the first instance, it is highly problematic that the technology is not effective. When we see a technology operating and it's not effective, and again, this bears out through research, the onus is put on the individual. The individual is seen as suspect. And I'm even just talking about a micro interaction. So, for example, if we go back to the case of the airport and you scan your fingerprint, but maybe you've cut your finger, and so it doesn't read accurately against the biometric that's on your passport. Nobody's really going to think about the fact that, you know, you've hurt yourself or something has changed in an innocent way, but it becomes suspicious. You become suspicious. There's something wrong because the technology hasn't worked.
Well, I would argue there that the technology has worked because it's picking up something different to your fingerprint slightly. But I get your point that there should be the latitude there in order to be able to deal with that in a humane and sensitive way.
Yeah. But I mean, when we think about the technology working, I mean, you know, Olga was talking about how people think about cameras and where the footage is coming from and how things are biased by the algorithm. But I would argue in that first instance as well, I mean, when cameras were trained, they were mostly trained on images of a white woman. And so the calibration of color, the ability of general, let's say, cameras, videos, recording devices to capture an image well, it's more calibrated towards a white face, right, than faces of color or non-Caucasian faces. So again, we're seeing that kind of layered issue that feeds into the effectiveness question or problem.
Absolutely. Olga, I suppose what would you like to see? What kind of engagements would you like to see between policymakers, researchers and advocacy groups such as yourselves?
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, I think I might just make a point about the academic side of things. On this particular topic, I have to say I think it's been phenomenal. And I think it's a really good example of how civil society has been able to kind of team up with academics on this subject. Like, first of all, we almost didn't even have pre-legislative scrutiny of that bill. And thankfully we did. And I think a lot of that was down to the advocacy by academics and civil society. That sounds a bit indulgent, but we did have to campaign for that. But also the actual, that pre-legislative scrutiny phase was hugely important. And the insight that people like Ciara, Dr. Abiba Barani, Dr. Elizabeth Faries, and many others, Dr. TJ McIntyre, many other academics was really invaluable and fed into that report. And those questions now are with the Department of Justice. But that's really, really important. And I think that going forward, that will have to continue. And I think that will involve really engaging with the AI Council Advisory's report, but also making sure that we get those answers to those questions and that those risks are identified and that it's very clear to us and to the public how the guards are going to mitigate against those risks and what they actually have done. Because we're already kind of starting at a poor position, and that is this reliance on this 99% accuracy figure, because it's just not representative of how it is at least planned or how it is stated in the draft legislation as to how FRT is going to be used here. And if I may, so I'm not just giving out about something without explaining it, in that 99% figure, the guards are citing a US National Institute of Standards and Technology report that looked at one of hundreds of algorithms. So it's just one particular algorithm. And this algorithm is called CloudWalk. It was developed by a Chinese company known for aiding mass surveillance of the Uyghur population. So crucial information around that algorithm is not known. But basically, that figure relates to the use of a very high quality, clean kind of mugshot image of a person against a database of very similar high quality mugshot types images. That is not representative of what is
the real world.
The real world here in Ireland.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because the guards want to use any imagery that they have in their possession. So they're not comparable. And also, even if you know, and the work of people like Dr. Barani, you know, has gone into this in detail, and it's in the Advisory Council report, where it looks like even if you dig down into that 99% figure, it would still have a disproportionate false match rate for people of colour. That's not insignificant. And that's why they're talking about this thorough independent evaluation and resolution of identified risks. So I think going forward, there has to be that continued engagement. Those questions have to be answered, but also there has to be a real effort and a real honest effort to engage the public on this, and especially communities who are going to be disproportionately affected. You know, we already, you know, there's reports out, you know, very recently highlighting concerns of young Black people in Dublin being disproportionately profiled by the guards, you know, aggressive questioning and disproportionate stopping and searching of them. And introducing FRT into this could make for extremely difficult policing, and that community policing piece being damaged and public trust being damaged.
Can I ask, when it comes to gnarly questions around technology and society, etc., sometimes art can help us make sense of it. Can I ask you about any good examples that you've seen where maybe people can go and check it out online themselves to kind of, you know, think more deeply about these things through art?
Oh, well, I'm a bit biased here, but last October, ICCL, we were thrilled to work with artist Emmeline Blake on a mural. Now, it's no longer there. Unfortunately, the council demanded it be taken down, so it's gone. But just to highlight, I suppose, so it had 3 images: a white man, an Asian woman, and a Black man. The aim was to highlight those twin dangers of misidentification and also the mass surveillance issue. So we had taken a real life headline from the New York Times, which was about that that gentleman, Robert Williams, I mentioned from earlier. And it was just the headline in the newspaper is wrongfully accused by an algorithm. Apologies. Going back to that misidentification risk. But we also tried to highlight the fact that this could just be kind of mass surveillance, where a guard would be just sitting at a computer and just being able to kind of pull up and identify people as to where they are with just kind of a click of a mouse scenario. The pictures on our website, it's no longer, the mural is no longer up, but we would have it on our website. And I know Emmeline themselves created a great video with voiceover on it, and that's on their Instagram as well.
Ciara, did you want to come in there?
I kind of want to go back to that last conversation about the real world conditions. So, you know, kind of intersecting this question of efficiency and accuracy, and of course the problems with and the challenges I think we should put forward against mass surveillance is that question of the real world conditions. So Olga's given examples where, you know, the one study that's seen this high accuracy figure had very specific photos matching against equally specific and set photos. You said it yourself, Claire, in real world conditions, I mean, this technology is not going to be a silver bullet. There's always workarounds that can allow people to evade a technology. The Dublin riots at the end of 2023 really...
November 2023, yeah.
Yeah. They provided, I think, the turning point, the kind of emergency situation for facial recognition technology to be reintroduced under the Digital Recording Devices Bill. But if we look at footage from the Dublin riots, I mean, trying to catch clear images of the individuals on CCTV or body-worn cameras, it was at night. Many people had hats on. They were wearing hoods. People might have had masks or... you know, various other things covering their faces, sunglasses and so forth. Those all impede the technology. So again, it's, you know, the bias is in the algorithm. It's also, you know, just unrealistic to think that we have this perfect gallery of images, which brings me back to the art question. So I was lucky to work with Emma Clark in ADAPT and Alexander Taylor, an artist in London, to create a piece ourselves to go into the European Researchers' Night and into the Beta Festival. And we called that Face Value. And we were just trying to think about putting together some type of installation to promote, to create, to evoke a visceral response and feeling in people as they moved through a space, to try and get them to think about how they might feel if they knew they were being exposed to facial recognition technology. And, between European Researchers' Night and Beta Fest, we evolved the art piece a little bit, but we had these different components. So one was first kind of encountering a camera and seeing that it was recognizing you as a person. Then you would see a gallery of images where people's faces had masks. So similar to Emmeline Blake's installation, this kind of
so this is
geometric,
the dots over the faces. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So this idea that we all recognize. And then another image where you can stand in front of a camera and it maps kind of your facial pattern. And the idea behind that was to get people to think about their own face being mapped, to perhaps create some sort of tension there for them that would get them to reflect on the technology. There was another piece in Beta Fest as well called Boogaloo Bias, which I wrote a response to, and that was a great piece. And it showed the intersection of facial recognition technology being used alongside a social network analysis. So the idea would be that once you're mapped, your network of personal connections, your daily habits and so forth can be extracted. And, all of a sudden you're getting full pictures of people, incorrect or correct, maybe, about individuals just by running facial recognition technology. And so I think, for me as an academic, it's been really interesting to turn to art a little bit more. And it was funny that the ICCL were commissioning this mural at the same time as we were working on an art piece. And Olga and I, along with the other colleagues Olga mentioned, have been working on responding to FRT for a number of years now. And I think we are turning to these alternative spaces to help increase public engagement on the topic. We've written op-eds, we've done articles, we've hosted think-ins, we're trying art as well. And I think in media, in these kind of multimedia new forms, it allows people to think about it in a different way. And I, for one, was enraptured by this new show called The Capture. Well, maybe it's not so new. I think you had watched it, Olga, as well. And it shows what can go wrong with facial recognition technology or digital imagery more generally. And I'd like to think, art and film and documentaries can really help increase that critical engagement around the technology.
So it is a gnarly subject, as I've mentioned before, and there's plenty to think about. But thank you so much, Dr. Ciara Bracken-Roche and Olga Cronin, for joining us today.
Thanks a million. It's been great to chat with you.
Thanks a million, Claire, and thank you very much to the ADAPT Centre too.
And if you would like to find out more about AI and facial recognition technology and ADAPT's work in this area, you can find lots of information in the show notes and at www.adaptcentre.ie. That's it for our podcast this time round. Until next time, from myself, Claire O'Connell, Slán, and thanks for listening.
The ADAPT Radio podcast is brought to you by the ADAPT Centre at Trinity College, Dublin. Find out more about their extensive research work at adaptcentre.ie. Join us next time to hear about more groundbreaking innovations. To get new episodes automatically, just click the follow button on your player right now. The ADAPT Radio podcast is produced by dustpod.io with episodes monthly on Apple, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts.